The morning after discovering Thomas and Amy's betrayals, I sat in my empty apartment surrounded by the debris of my former life. My career was suspended pending investigation of planted evidence, my bank accounts were frozen by litigation, my family had stolen my inheritance, and the two people I'd trusted most had been working for my enemies, all along. Most people would have surrendered at this point, but growing up with Grandmother Ruth had taught me that sometimes you have to lose everything before you can see clearly enough to fight back effectively. The knock on my door came at exactly 9 in the morning, and I almost didn't answer it. But when I looked through the peephole, I saw an elderly man in an expensive suit holding a briefcase and looking nervously around the hallway. Something about his demeanor suggested this wasn't another process server or investigator working for my family. I opened the door to find Henry Morrison, my grandmother's personal accountant for over 30 years, standing in the hallway with tears in his eyes. "Miss Kane," he said formally, "I've been watching the news coverage of your situation, and I can't remain silent any longer. Your grandmother made me promise to protect certain information until you needed it most. I believe that time has arrived." Henry's voice shook with emotion as he explained that Grandmother Ruth had suspected family members might try to steal my inheritance, and she'd taken extensive precautions to protect her final wishes. Inside his briefcase were copies of financial records that my parents had never seen. Grandmother Ruth had maintained secret accounts in 3 different banks, documenting every aspect of her estate planning with meticulous detail. She'd also hired private investigators to monitor family members' financial activities, apparently concerned that her wealth might create temptation for theft. The evidence Henry showed me proved that my grandmother had been preparing for exactly the kind of fraud my parents had committed. But the most shocking discovery was a sealed letter addressed to me, written just 2 weeks before Grandmother's death. In her familiar handwriting, she documented her growing suspicions about Richard's gambling problems and Diane's prescription drug abuse. She'd even noted Derek's increasingly expensive lifestyle and his requests for larger and more frequent loans. The letter concluded with specific instructions for protecting my inheritance if family members tried to steal it. Henry revealed that Grandmother had secretly recorded several conversations with my parents where they'd discussed plans for accessing my inheritance early. The audio files were devastating, capturing Richard and Diane explicitly planning to use their executor authority to transfer money to Derek while claiming it came from their personal wealth. They'd even laughed about my trusting nature, joking that I was too naive to notice what they were doing until it was too late. "Your grandmother was a brilliant woman who understood human nature better than most," Henry explained as we reviewed the secret evidence. "She loved your parents and Derek, but she recognized their weaknesses and took steps to ensure they couldn't destroy your future. She specifically chose you as her primary heir because she believed you had the strength and intelligence to honor her legacy properly." The weight of Grandmother's faith in me felt both empowering and overwhelming. Armed with Henry's evidence, I reached out to Victoria Chin, an investigative journalist whose series on family financial fraud had won several national awards. Victoria had been following my story in the media and immediately recognized the significance of Grandmother's secret documentation. "This isn't just about recovering stolen money," she explained during our first meeting. "This is about exposing a type of crime that destroys families across America every day. Your grandmother's foresight gives us the evidence. We need to tell that story properly." Victoria's investigation revealed the scope of similar crimes happening nationwide. Elder financial abuse and inheritance theft were epidemic problems that law enforcement struggled to address because victims were often embarrassed to admit their family members had betrayed them. My case had the documentation and public visibility needed to shed light on these hidden crimes and potentially help thousands of other victims find justice. The collaboration with Victoria also connected me with other families who'd experienced similar betrayals. I joined support groups where adult children shared stories of parents who'd stolen inheritances and siblings who'd conspired to rob each other blind. Hearing their experiences helped me understand that I wasn't alone in facing this type of family devastation, and many of them had successfully rebuilt their lives after exposing their relatives' crimes. Henry's evidence also attracted the attention of federal prosecutors who specialized in complex financial crimes. The audio recordings and secret documents provided the foundation for a RICO investigation into my family's conspiracy, elevating their theft from simple fraud to organized criminal activity. Special Agent Patricia Williams explained that the sophistication of their money laundering and the coordination between multiple participants qualified their actions for federal prosecution under racketeering statutes. But the most empowering aspect of Henry's revelations was discovering that Grandmother Ruth had anticipated my parents' psychological warfare tactics. Her letters included detailed descriptions of manipulation techniques she'd observed them using on Derek throughout his life, along with warnings about how they might try to gaslight me during any inheritance dispute. Reading her insights helped me understand that their current behavior followed established patterns of control and deception. The secret accounts Henry revealed also contained additional funds that my parents had never discovered. Grandmother Ruth had hidden nearly $8 million in investments that weren't included in the will they'd seen, creating a financial foundation I could use to fight for justice without depending on their stolen money. These resources allowed me to hire the best legal representation available and pursue my case without the financial pressure they'd hoped to create. Victoria's media coverage began shifting public opinion as we revealed the depth of Grandmother's preparations and the evidence she'd left behind. The narrative changed from a story about a greedy daughter fighting her generous family to an investigation of sophisticated financial fraud planned by parents who'd systematically betrayed their child's trust. Editorial coverage began focusing on the broader issue of family financial abuse and the need for stronger legal protections for inheritance rights. The psychological impact of Grandmother's support, even from beyond the grave, was profound. Reading her letters and listening to her recordings reminded me of the woman who'd shaped my values and taught me to stand up for what was right. She'd anticipated this battle and equipped me with the tools I needed to win it, transforming me from a victim of betrayal into a warrior fighting for justice. With Henry's evidence and Victoria's platform, I finally had the weapons needed to expose my family's crimes and reclaim what they'd stolen from both of us. The federal investigation that Victoria's articles triggered moved with breathtaking speed once Special Agent Williams' team examined Henry's secret evidence. Within 2 weeks of my meeting with Henry, FBI agents were executing search warrants at my parents' home, Derek's apartment, and the offices of their corrupt lawyer, Harrison Blackwood. The raids made front-page news across the country, with images of federal agents carrying boxes of evidence from properties my family had bought with stolen money. The forensic accounting team working with federal prosecutors uncovered financial crimes that extended far beyond my stolen inheritance. Richard's gambling debts were connected to organized crime figures who'd been using his business accounts to launder money from illegal operations. The IRS discovered that my parents had been evading taxes on millions of dollars in income for over 5 years, using offshore accounts and fake business expenses to hide their true financial situation. What had started as inheritance theft had exposed a criminal empire built on decades of fraud. Derek's arrest came first, triggered by evidence of violent behavior during one of his cocaine-fueled rages. Surveillance footage from his apartment building showed him assaulting a neighbor who'd complained about noise, and toxicology reports revealed dangerous levels of illegal substances in his system. The assault charges provided grounds for immediate arrest while federal prosecutors prepared more serious financial crime indictments. The sight of Derek in handcuffs being perp-walked in front of news cameras was profoundly satisfying after months of watching him play the innocent victim. His carefully constructed public image collapsed completely when body camera footage showed him screaming threats at arresting officers and demanding special treatment because of his family's wealth. The contrast between his polite television interviews and his real personality under pressure was striking enough to make national news. Claire's abandonment of Derek happened so quickly it would have been comical if it weren't so predictable. Within 24 hours of his arrest, she'd moved out of his apartment and was photographed having dinner with another wealthy man 30 years older than herself. Her statements to media claiming she'd been deceived about Derek's true character were laughably transparent attempts to distance herself from his legal troubles while positioning herself as another victim of his manipulation. Richard's downfall was even more spectacular because of his desperate attempts to maintain his respectable businessman facade. When federal agents traced his gambling debts to connections with violent criminals, several of his creditors decided to cooperate with authorities rather than risk prosecution themselves. The testimony revealed that Richard had been borrowing money from increasingly dangerous sources, using grandmother's trust fund as collateral for loans he had no legal right to make. But Richard's most devastating mistake was trying to flee the country when he realized federal prosecutors were building an airtight case. Airport security arrested him at the departure gate for a flight to a non-extradition country, and searches of his luggage revealed forged documents and over $200,000 in cash. The attempted flight destroyed any remaining credibility he might have maintained and demonstrated consciousness of guilt that prosecutors could use to support every charge they filed. Diane's collapse was perhaps the most tragic because her prescription drug addiction had clearly impaired her judgment throughout the conspiracy. When federal agents interviewed her, she was barely coherent and rambling about elaborate paranoid fantasies involving government plots and family enemies. Her overdose, apparently accidental, resulted in hospitalization and psychiatric evaluation that revealed the extent of her mental deterioration over the past several years. The corrupt lawyer Harrison Blackwood's arrest was particularly satisfying because his arrogance had made him sloppy about covering his tracks. Federal investigators discovered that he'd been operating similar inheritance theft schemes for multiple wealthy families, using his legal expertise to create fraudulent documents and manipulate probate proceedings. His client files contained evidence of crimes affecting dozens of families across several states. My law firm partnership offer restoration came with a personal apology from the managing partner, who'd reviewed the federal evidence and realized how thoroughly I'd been framed. The planted embezzlement evidence was traced to a private investigation firm hired by my parents, and security footage analysis revealed exactly how the fake documents had been placed in my office. My suspension was immediately lifted, and the firm offered me a senior partnership track with a focus on elder abuse prevention. The media vindication was sweet but couldn't fully compensate for months of character assassination and professional humiliation. Editorial boards that had initially criticized my public accusations against my family now wrote lengthy apologies acknowledging their rush to judgment. Television commentators who'd portrayed me as a greedy, unstable daughter suddenly discovered their concern for inheritance theft victims and the importance of believing family financial abuse survivors. But the most satisfying moment came when Grandmother Ruth's true final will was discovered in a safety deposit box that Henry had maintained secretly for over 10 years. The document revealed additional assets worth $15 million that my parents had never known existed, along with specific instructions for charitable giving that honored Grandmother's lifetime philanthropic commitments. The discovery proved that her estate planning had been even more sophisticated than anyone realized. The financial recovery exceeded my wildest expectations as federal authorities seized assets my family had purchased with stolen money. Their homes, cars, investment accounts, and business interests were all subject to forfeiture proceedings, with the proceeds designated for restitution to victims of their crimes. The final accounting showed recoveries totaling over $60 million, significantly more than my original inheritance because of penalties and interest calculations. Thomas's desperate attempts to reconcile became increasingly pathetic as the federal investigation vindicated everything I'd told him during our relationship. His phone calls and text messages alternated between apologies for his betrayal and attempts to claim he'd been manipulated into spying on me. But the financial records of his payments from my father made his motivations clear, and his credibility as a romantic partner was permanently destroyed by his willingness to sell our relationship for money. Amy's public apology came in the form of a television interview where she admitted her role in Derek's information-gathering operation. Her tears seemed genuine as she described the guilt and shame that had consumed her since realizing how thoroughly she'd been used. But her betrayal had revealed fundamental character flaws that couldn't be erased by remorse, and our friendship was another casualty of my family's criminal conspiracy that could never be repaired. The federal prosecution team's final indictments read like a criminal organization case study, with charges including racketeering, money laundering, conspiracy to commit fraud, tax evasion, and elder abuse. The evidence was so overwhelming that plea negotiations began immediately, with each defendant trying to minimize their sentence by cooperating against the others. The family that had once presented a united front against me was now desperately betraying each other to save themselves from decades in federal prison. The forensic accounting report landed like a nuclear bomb in my family's carefully constructed world. Within 24 hours of receiving Margaret's findings, I'd filed criminal complaints with both local police and federal authorities, triggering investigations that would expose every aspect of their elaborate fraud. But my parents and Derek weren't going to surrender without a fight, and their counterattack proved they were willing to destroy me completely rather than face justice for their crimes. Richard and Diane's response was swift and vicious. By the end of the week, they'd hired Thornton, Wells and Associates, one of the city's most aggressive defense firms, known for representing wealthy clients who'd found themselves on the wrong side of the law. Their strategy became clear immediately. If they couldn't hide their theft, they'd try to paint me as an unstable, greedy daughter who was fabricating evidence to steal money that rightfully belonged to her generous brother. The smear campaign began with carefully planted stories in local media outlets. Anonymous sources close to the family suggested that I'd been struggling with mental health issues for months, pointing to my intense work schedule and recent breakup with a long-term boyfriend as evidence of psychological instability. They claimed I'd become obsessed with money and jealous of Derek's success, leading to increasingly paranoid behavior that culminated in my public breakdown at the charity gala. Derek's performance proved Oscar-worthy as he embraced his new role as the innocent victim of his sister's delusions. In a tearful television interview, he claimed that he'd only accepted the $15 million gift because our parents had convinced him it would help establish his independence and allow him to support important charitable causes. He portrayed himself as a loving brother who was devastated by my accusations and desperately worried about my mental state. But Derek's most manipulative move came 3 days after I filed the criminal complaints. Claire called emergency services after allegedly finding Derek unconscious in his apartment bathroom with an empty bottle of sleeping pills nearby. The suicide attempt made front-page news, with Derek claiming in a hospital bed interview that the stress of my false accusations had driven him to despair. The image of him connected to medical monitors while discussing his fear of losing his sister's love was heartbreaking television that generated enormous public sympathy. What the media didn't know was that Derek's overdose had been carefully calculated. Medical records that surfaced later showed that he'd taken exactly the amount of medication needed to require hospitalization without causing actual danger. The timing, just hours before a scheduled deposition in my civil lawsuit, suggested this was strategic theater designed to delay legal proceedings and generate sympathy for his position. My parents' legal team immediately moved to freeze all assets connected to grandmother's estate, claiming they needed to protect the funds from my allegedly reckless accusations. This legal maneuver effectively cut off my access to resources I needed to fight their theft, creating a situation where I was forced to finance my own legal battle while they used my stolen inheritance to pay for their defense. The irony was devastating. They were using my money to hire lawyers who would argue that I had no right to that money. The pressure campaign extended to my professional life. Partners at my law firm began receiving calls from unnamed sources suggesting that I was involved in a family financial dispute that might reflect poorly on the firm's reputation. Several major clients mysteriously requested new representation, and I found myself excluded from important meetings and case assignments. The message was clear. My family's wealth and connections gave them the power to destroy my career if I didn't withdraw my accusations. Social media became another battlefield where their hired trolls worked overtime to demolish my reputation. Fake accounts posted detailed stories about my alleged mental health struggles, my supposed history of lying and manipulation, and my desperate attempts to steal money from my hardworking brother. The comment sections of news articles became toxic wastelands filled with character assassination designed to make me appear unstable and vindictive. The harassment escalated to physical intimidation when my apartment was vandalized twice in 1 week. Someone had spray-painted "Greedy Liar" across my front door and slashed my car tires, while also somehow gaining access to my building to leave threatening notes under my door. When I reported these incidents to police, the responding officers seemed skeptical about my claims, suggesting that I might be staging incidents to support my victim narrative. My parents' lawyers filed a cascade of restraining orders and civil lawsuits designed to bury me in legal paperwork and court appearances. They accused me of harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, claiming that my public accusations had destroyed Derek's reputation and caused severe trauma to the entire family. Each lawsuit required separate legal representation and consumed more of my dwindling financial resources. The most devastating blow came when they successfully convinced several witnesses to sign affidavits supporting their version of events. Former household employees, family friends, and even some of my own colleagues provided statements describing my allegedly erratic behavior and my history of jealousy toward Derek. Many of these witnesses later admitted they'd been paid for their cooperation, but their initial statements created a compelling narrative that I was a disturbed individual fabricating elaborate conspiracy theories. Professional investigators hired by my parents began following me everywhere, photographing my daily activities and documenting my interactions with friends and colleagues. They were building a case that I was unstable and obsessive, collecting evidence they could use to support their claims about my mental state. The constant surveillance made me paranoid and isolated, which ironically supported their argument that I was becoming increasingly disconnected from reality. The campaign reached its climax when fabricated evidence appeared in my law firm office. Someone had planted financial documents suggesting I'd been embezzling client funds to finance my legal battle against my family. The planted evidence was sophisticated enough to fool a casual examination, and security footage that might have revealed how it got there had mysteriously malfunctioned during the relevant time period. The discovery triggered an immediate internal investigation that suspended me from practice pending resolution. My arrest came at the worst possible moment, just as I was preparing to present my evidence to federal prosecutors. The charges of embezzlement and fraud were carefully timed to coincide with maximum media coverage, creating a narrative that I was a corrupt lawyer who'd been caught stealing money and was now desperately trying to blame my innocent family for my own crimes. The perp walk photos made front pages nationwide, showing me in handcuffs being led away from my office while former colleagues watched in shock and disgust. The jail cell was cold and humiliating, but nothing compared to the emotional devastation waiting for me when I was finally released on bail. As I walked out of the courthouse, squinting in the afternoon sunlight, I expected to see my boyfriend Thomas waiting to take me home. Instead, I found him standing with my parents and Derek, his familiar face twisted with disappointment and disgust. The man I'd been planning to marry, the one person I'd trusted completely throughout this nightmare, looked at me like I was a stranger. "Jessica," Thomas said, his voice flat and distant, "we need to talk." His tone carried finality that made my stomach drop. After 18 months of a relationship I'd thought was building toward marriage, after nights spent discussing our future and sharing our deepest fears, he was looking at me like I'd become someone he no longer recognized. The bail hearing had been a public spectacle, and Thomas had witnessed every humiliating moment from the gallery. "I can't do this anymore," he continued, refusing to meet my eyes. "I thought I knew you, but finding out about the embezzlement charges, seeing how you've torn your family apart over money, this isn't the woman I fell in love with." His words hit harder than any physical blow because they echoed exactly what my parents had been telling the media for weeks. The man I'd shared everything with had apparently been listening to their lies instead of trusting what he knew about my character. But Thomas's betrayal was just the beginning of a revelation that would shatter my remaining faith in human nature. As we stood outside the courthouse, he pulled out his phone to show me bank deposit records that made my blood freeze. "Your father paid me $50,000 to document everything you've told me about your legal strategy," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "They've been paying me for information since this whole thing started." The betrayal was so complete, so devastating, that I actually staggered backward as the full implications hit me. Every intimate conversation we'd shared over dinner, every legal strategy I discussed while lying next to him in bed, every vulnerable moment when I'd expressed my fears and doubts about fighting my own family, all of it had been reported back to the people who were trying to destroy me. Thomas had been a spy in my own relationship, collecting intelligence that my enemies used to stay one step ahead of my legal moves. They approached me right after the gala, he explained, his confession tumbling out in a rush of guilt and self-justification. Your father said they were worried about your mental state and just wanted to make sure you were getting proper care. He made it sound like they were trying to help you, like they needed information to stage an intervention if your behavior became dangerous. Even as he tried to rationalize his betrayal, Thomas couldn't look directly at me, his eyes focused somewhere over my left shoulder. The financial records on his phone revealed the systematic nature of his deception. $50,000 in total, paid in weekly installments of $5,000 each, with bonuses for particularly valuable information. There were even email records showing him reporting our conversations in detail, including verbatim quotes of things I'd said during our most private moments. The man I'd been planning to marry had literally been selling my secrets to finance his own lifestyle. But the revelation about Thomas was only the appetizer for an even more devastating main course. My best friend since childhood, Amy Richardson, appeared at the courthouse just as Thomas was leaving. I felt a surge of relief seeing her familiar face until I noticed she wasn't alone. Derek emerged from a black sedan parked across the street, and the way Amy immediately moved to his side told me everything I needed to know about whose team she was really playing for. Jessica, Amy said, her voice carrying the same distant tone I'd just heard from Thomas. I need you to know that I never wanted it to go this far. Her confession hit like a second earthquake while I was still reeling from the first one. Amy, who'd been my maid of honor at my college graduation, who'd held my hand through our grandmother's funeral, who'd spent countless hours listening to me agonize over family dynamics, she'd been working with Derek all along. The details of Amy's betrayal were even more extensive than Thomas's treachery. She'd been feeding Derek information about my emotional state, my legal strategy, and my financial resources for months. Every coffee date where I'd confided my fears about the inheritance situation, every phone call where I discussed my growing suspicions about my parents' behavior, every text message where I'd shared updates about my investigation, all of it had been immediately reported to the people who were robbing me blind. Derek convinced me that you were having some kind of breakdown, Amy explained, her justification sounding rehearsed and hollow. He showed me evidence that you were becoming paranoid and obsessive about money. He said the family was planning an intervention, and they needed my help to understand how serious your condition had become. The fact that she'd believed Derek's lies over our 20-year friendship revealed how little our relationship had actually meant to her. But Amy's betrayal went deeper than simple information gathering. She'd actively participated in gaslighting me throughout the investigation. When I confided my suspicions about the missing inheritance money, she'd suggested that I was overreacting and letting stress affect my judgment. When I'd shared my concerns about my parents' evasive behavior, she'd reminded me that estate management was complicated and I should trust their expertise. Her seemingly supportive responses had actually been psychological manipulation designed to make me doubt my own perceptions. The most devastating revelation came when Amy showed me her own bank records. Derek had been paying her $25,000 monthly for 6 months, ostensibly for consulting services related to family communications. But the real payment was for her willingness to betray someone who'd trusted her completely. She'd sold our friendship for money, providing Derek with intimate details about my personality and emotional vulnerabilities that he could exploit in his defense strategy. Standing outside that courthouse, surrounded by the wreckage of 2 relationships I'd thought were unbreakable, I felt more alone than I'd ever imagined possible. The 2 people I'd trusted most in the world had been working for my enemies, collecting information that was used to anticipate my legal moves and undermine my credibility. Every strategy session with my lawyers, every piece of evidence I'd discovered, every emotional breakthrough I'd experienced, all of it had been immediately compromised by the people closest to me. The sophistication of their betrayal revealed the true scope of my family's conspiracy. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was psychological warfare designed to isolate me completely and destroy my ability to fight back effectively. They turned my own love and trust against me, using my relationships as weapons in their campaign to steal my inheritance and obliterate my reputation. The depth of their planning suggested they'd been anticipating this confrontation for months, carefully positioning their chess pieces for maximum devastation when the game finally began. As I walked away from the courthouse alone, I realized that recovering my stolen money was only part of the battle I was facing. I needed to rebuild my entire understanding of human nature and learn to trust my own judgment again. The people who'd raised me and the relationships I'd cherished most had all been illusions, carefully maintained deceptions that collapsed the moment my interests conflicted with their plans. The real war was just beginning, and now I knew exactly how ruthless my enemies were willing to be. I'm Jessica Kane, 28 years old, and I thought I knew my family until the night they tried to steal $15 million from me on live television. Standing in that glittering hotel ballroom, watching my parents beam as they handed my younger brother Derek a ceremonial check for money that legally belonged to me, I felt my world shatter. The applause thundered around us as cameras flashed, capturing what everyone believed was an act of incredible parental generosity. But I knew the truth about that money. It came from my late grandmother's trust fund, and every penny was rightfully mine. As Derek raised the check above his head like a trophy, grinning at the cheering crowd, something snapped inside me. I stood up, my chair scraping against the marble floor, and reached for the microphone. Before we dive into this story of betrayal and justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how I exposed my family's lies in front of hundreds of people, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, what happened next will leave you speechless. 6 months before that devastating night, I was living what I thought was a perfect life. As a successful corporate lawyer specializing in estate planning, I'd built a reputation for protecting families from exactly the kind of financial abuse I was about to experience myself. My downtown law office overlooked the city, and my clients trusted me with their most valuable assets. I should have been more suspicious when my own family started acting strange about money, but love makes you blind to the worst possibilities. My grandmother Ruth had passed away just 6 months earlier, leaving behind a fortune that none of us had fully comprehended. She'd been a shrewd businesswoman who'd invested wisely throughout her life, accumulating wealth that stretched far beyond what any of us imagined. When the lawyer read her will, we learned she'd left the bulk of her estate in a trust fund designated specifically for me, her eldest grandchild, and the one who'd followed in her footsteps by pursuing law. The amount was staggering. $45 million, with clear instructions that it should be released to me on my 29th birthday, just 8 months away. My parents, Richard and Diane Kane, had been named as temporary executors of the estate. I'd felt grateful for their willingness to handle the complex financial arrangements, especially since I was buried in a particularly challenging case at the firm. Richard had always been the family's financial manager, running several successful businesses, while Diane handled the social aspects of our wealthy lifestyle. They seemed like the natural choice to shepherd grandmother's assets until I was ready to receive them. Derek, my 26-year-old brother, had always been the golden child in our family. Where I was serious and career-focused, he was charming and adventurous. Our parents had indulged his every whim, from expensive cars to failed business ventures that they'd quietly funded. His latest obsession was cryptocurrency trading, which he approached with the same reckless enthusiasm he brought to everything else. I'd heard whispers about mounting debts and bad investments, but Derek always managed to bounce back somehow, usually with help from our parents' checkbook. The annual charity gala honoring grandmother's memory had been held every December for the past 15 years. It was a glamorous affair that brought together the city's elite to raise money for education initiatives that grandmother had supported. This year felt different, though. There was an undercurrent of excitement that I couldn't quite identify. My parents had been secretive about the evening's program, claiming they wanted to surprise everyone with something special. Derek had been unusually confident lately, talking about big plans and exciting opportunities without providing any specifics. Looking back, I should have noticed the red flags earlier. My parents had grown increasingly evasive whenever I brought up the inheritance details. Simple questions about investment performance or timeline logistics were met with vague assurances that everything was progressing smoothly. They'd even suggested that I didn't need to worry about such complicated financial matters, that I should focus on my career while they handled the boring administrative work. Their sudden desire to shield me from financial discussions should have triggered my professional instincts, but instead, I felt touched by their protective concern. Derek's behavior had changed too. The brother who'd always come to me for advice and financial help was suddenly talking about independence and self-reliance. He'd stopped asking for loans and had even paid back some old debts to friends. When I congratulated him on turning his financial situation around, he just smiled mysteriously and said he had some incredible opportunities coming up. The pieces were all there, scattered in plain sight, but my trust in my family blinded me to the obvious pattern. The gala planning had consumed our family for months. My parents had insisted on making this year's event the biggest and most memorable yet, claiming they wanted to honor grandmother's legacy in a truly spectacular way. They'd rented the city's most prestigious ballroom, hired celebrity entertainment, and invited every prominent figure in our social circle. The guest list read like a who's who of politics, business, and media. When I'd questioned the elaborate expense, they'd assured me it would all be worth it for such an important cause. What I didn't realize was that they were planning to use the gala as the perfect stage for their deception. The cameras, the crowd, the media attention, it was all designed to create a public spectacle that would make it nearly impossible for me to challenge their narrative without appearing ungrateful and greedy. They'd orchestrated every detail to position Derek as the deserving recipient of their generosity while casting themselves as extraordinarily loving parents. The trap was elaborate and calculated, and I walked right into it with complete trust. The moment Derek raised that $15 million check above his head, the ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. 500 of the city's most influential people rose to their feet, celebrating what they believed was an extraordinary act of parental love. Cameras flashed from every angle as reporters captured the seemingly heartwarming moment for tomorrow's headlines. Derek's face glowed with triumph as he pulled our parents into an emotional embrace, all three of them basking in the admiration of the crowd. But from my table near the stage, I could see the truth behind their performance. My hands trembled as I stood up, the sound of my chair scraping against the marble floor barely audible over the ongoing applause. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't their money to give. Every dollar of that $15 million had come from grandmother's trust fund, the inheritance that was legally and morally mine. They hadn't just stolen my money. They'd stolen my grandmother's final wish and turned it into their own public relations triumph. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice cutting through the celebration. The applause began to falter as people turned to see who was interrupting the magical moment. I made my way toward the stage, my legal training kicking in as adrenaline flooded my system. This was fraud on a massive scale, and they'd chosen to commit it in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple news cameras. Derek's expression shifted from joy to confusion as he spotted me approaching the stage. Our parents' faces went pale as they realized their carefully orchestrated plan was about to unravel. Richard stepped forward, probably hoping to intercept me before I could reach the microphone, but I was already climbing the steps to the platform. "Ladies and gentlemen," I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "I'm Jessica Kane, and I need to tell you something important about this generous gift you've just witnessed." The ballroom fell completely silent as 500 people strained to hear what I had to say. Derek stood frozen, the check still in his hands, while our parents exchanged panicked glances behind him. "This $15 million didn't come from my parents' personal wealth," I continued, my legal training helping me project confidence despite the emotional turmoil inside. "This money was stolen from my late grandmother's trust fund, an inheritance that legally belongs to me." Gasps rippled through the crowd as the implications of my statement sank in. The cameras that had been capturing a heartwarming family moment were now documenting what might be one of the biggest financial scandals the city had ever seen. Derek dropped the check as if it had caught fire, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "Jessica, "What are you talking about?" he finally managed to stammer. "Mom and Dad gave me this money." I didn't know anything about grandmother's trust. His performance was convincing, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew exactly what they'd done. Richard rushed to the microphone, trying to push me aside. "Please excuse my daughter," he announced to the crowd, his voice shaking with forced authority. "She's been under tremendous stress lately, and she's clearly confused about our family's financial arrangements." But I wasn't backing down. Too much was at stake, and I had 500 witnesses to the truth. "I'm not confused," I replied firmly, pulling out my phone to display the legal documents I'd photographed earlier that week. "I have copies of my grandmother's will right here, clearly stating that her estate was to be held in trust for me until my 29th birthday. These people standing next to me are the temporary executors who were supposed to protect my inheritance, not steal it for their own purposes." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs as people began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't a generous family moment. It was a public exposure of massive fraud. Several guests pulled out their phones to record the confrontation, while reporters pushed closer to the stage for better angles. What had started as a charity gala was quickly becoming breaking news. Diane tried to salvage the situation by appealing to the crowd's emotions. "Please don't listen to these terrible accusations," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Jessica has been jealous of Derek her entire life. She can't stand to see him succeed." But her performance felt hollow compared to the legal evidence I was presenting. Security guards began moving toward the stage, probably called by my parents to remove me from the premises. But the damage was already done. The truth was out, captured by dozens of cameras and witnessed by hundreds of people. Derek's girlfriend Claire stepped forward to support his denial, claiming that Derek had worked hard for this opportunity and deserved the recognition. Her loyalty would prove costly later, when the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. As security reached the stage, I handed the microphone back to the stunned event coordinator and walked calmly toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear the chaos erupting as guests demanded explanations and reporters shouted questions. The gala had completely collapsed, with people streaming toward the exits while others clustered in groups to discuss what they'd just witnessed. Outside the hotel, I found myself surrounded by reporters and camera crews. For the first time in my life, I was making headlines, but not for my legal achievements. "Miss Kane," a reporter called out, "are you planning to press charges against your family?" I looked directly into the camera and gave the answer that would define everything that followed. Justice doesn't care about family relationships. Theft is theft, whether it's committed by strangers or the people who raised you. The video went viral within hours. Social media exploded with clips of my confrontation, and news outlets picked up the story nationwide. What had started as a private family betrayal was now public knowledge, and there was no going back. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, friends, and colleagues, but I ignored them all. I had bigger problems to deal with, like figuring out how to recover $45 million from people who'd raised me to trust them completely. The morning after the gala disaster, I sat in my downtown office reviewing the legal documents that would change everything. My hands shook as I dialed the number for Peterson and Associates, the city's most respected forensic accounting firm. If my suspicions were correct, the $15 million Derek had received was just the tip of an enormous iceberg. My grandmother's estate was worth $45 million, and I needed to know exactly how much had already disappeared. Margaret Peterson arrived at my office within 2 hours, bringing a team of specialists who immediately began dissecting every financial record I could provide. As a forensic accountant who'd exposed corporate fraud for Fortune 500 companies, she knew exactly what to look for. "Jessica," she said grimly after reviewing the initial documents, "this isn't amateur hour. Someone with sophisticated financial knowledge planned this operation very carefully." The investigation revealed a pattern of systematic theft that had begun the moment my parents gained access to the trust fund. Over the past 6 months, they'd executed nearly 40 separate transactions designed to slowly bleed the estate dry while maintaining the appearance of normal investment activity. Money had been transferred through a complex network of shell companies, each transaction small enough to avoid triggering automatic reporting requirements, but collectively representing millions of dollars. Richard's gambling debts were the first shocking discovery. My father, who'd always presented himself as a conservative businessman, had apparently been betting massive amounts on everything from horse races to offshore sports books. His losses over the past 2 years totaled $8 million, with most of those debts owed to some very dangerous people. The pressure to pay these creditors had obviously motivated his desperate theft from my inheritance. But Richard wasn't working alone. Diane had actively participated in the conspiracy, using her social connections to create investment opportunities that existed only on paper. She'd convinced several wealthy friends to participate in fake business ventures, using their legitimate investments to help cover the money trail. Her prescription drug addiction, which I'd never suspected, had apparently escalated to the point where she was spending thousands of dollars monthly on illegal pharmaceuticals. Derek's role proved more extensive than his innocent performance at the gala had suggested. Bank records showed that he'd received over $3 million in loans from the shell companies over the past 4 months. These weren't emergency payments. They were systematic distributions designed to establish his claim to family wealth before I could inherit legally. He'd even opened accounts in multiple countries, apparently preparing for the possibility that he'd need to flee when their scheme collapsed. The legal complexity of their fraud was staggering. They'd forged documents, bribed witnesses, and even created fake death certificates to suggest that distant relatives had claims on the estate. Margaret's team discovered that they'd hired a corrupt lawyer named Harrison Blackwood to create legal justifications for their theft. Blackwood had falsified probate documents and notarized signatures that were obviously fraudulent when examined by experts. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that they'd been planning to have me declared mentally incompetent. Medical records showed that they'd consulted with psychiatrists about having me committed for evaluation, claiming I'd been showing signs of paranoid delusions and financial irresponsibility. They'd even gathered statements from people who'd agreed to testify that I'd been acting erratically, probably in exchange for financial compensation. The shell companies they'd created were masterpieces of financial deception. Cascade Investment Holdings, Mountain View Development, and Pacific Trust Management all appeared to be legitimate investment firms with real addresses and professional websites. In reality, they were nothing but post office boxes and web domains designed to facilitate money laundering. Each company had its own banking relationships and investment portfolios, creating a maze of transactions that would have been nearly impossible for a casual observer to unravel. My parents had even intercepted legal correspondence intended for me. Letters from banks, investment firms, and government agencies had been redirected to addresses they controlled, ensuring that I remained unaware of the massive financial activity surrounding my inheritance. They'd forged my signature on documents acknowledging receipt of information I'd never actually seen, creating a paper trail suggesting I was actively involved in investment decisions. The most painful discovery came when Margaret showed me evidence that my family had been planning to make me disappear entirely from the inheritance equation. They'd researched legal precedents for disinheriting beneficiaries who challenged estate decisions, apparently hoping to find a way to void my grandmother's will completely. Draft documents suggested they were preparing to claim that I'd been manipulating grandmother before her death, trying to portray me as an elder abuse perpetrator who didn't deserve any inheritance. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of their plan was how they'd used the charity gala as cover for their final heist. The $15 million they'd publicly given to Derek represented the last major asset in my grandmother's estate. By making this transfer in front of hundreds of witnesses and multiple cameras, they'd hoped to create a public narrative that would make it difficult for me to challenge their actions without appearing selfish and vindictive. As Margaret's team continued their investigation, we discovered that my parents had been working with financial advisors in 3 different countries. They'd established accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Singapore, apparently preparing to disappear with whatever money they couldn't legitimately transfer to Derek. Their passport records showed multiple recent trips to these locations, where they'd undoubtedly been setting up their escape route. The scope of their betrayal was so comprehensive that it took Margaret's entire team working around the clock for a full week to map the complete financial conspiracy. When they finally presented their findings, the evidence filled 3 large binders and painted a picture of fraud so extensive that it qualified for federal prosecution. My loving family hadn't just stolen my inheritance. They'd built an entire criminal enterprise around robbing me blind while maintaining the pretense of caring for my best interests. The federal courthouse steps became a familiar location over the following months as each member of my family faced the consequences of their elaborate criminal conspiracy. The media circus surrounding their trials attracted national attention, transforming my personal betrayal into a cautionary tale about family financial abuse that resonated with victims across the country. Every hearing brought new revelations about the scope of their crimes and the sophisticated planning they'd used to steal my inheritance while maintaining their respectable public image. Derek's plea bargain came first, negotiated by lawyers who recognized that his cooperation against our parents might be his only hope for avoiding a life sentence. His testimony revealed details about the conspiracy that even federal investigators hadn't suspected, including plans to fake his own death and disappear to South America if their scheme had succeeded. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors recommended a sentence of 7 years in federal prison with full restitution requirements that would consume any assets he might acquire for the rest of his life. The sentencing hearing was emotionally devastating as Derek finally acknowledged the reality of what they'd done to me. His statement to the court was the first time he'd taken genuine responsibility for his actions rather than blaming others or claiming victimhood. I destroyed my relationship with a sister who'd always protected me because I was selfish and greedy, he admitted, his voice breaking with what seemed like authentic remorse. Jessica deserved better from her family, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for betraying her trust. Richard's trial was a spectacle that exposed the full extent of his financial crimes and gambling addiction. Federal prosecutors presented evidence showing that he'd been stealing from clients and business partners for over a decade, using increasingly sophisticated fraud schemes to finance his compulsive betting. His conviction on 37 federal charges resulted in a sentence of 15 years in prison, with restitution orders totaling $42 million that would ensure his financial ruin for any remaining years of his life. The most dramatic moment of Richard's sentencing came when he attempted to deliver a statement minimizing his responsibility and blaming his actions on gambling addiction. Federal Judge Margaret Stone interrupted his excuses with a scathing rebuke that became widely quoted in legal circles. Mr. Kane, you didn't steal millions of dollars because you had an addiction problem. You had an addiction problem because you'd already decided that other people's money belonged to you. Your daughter's inheritance wasn't destroyed by your gambling. It was stolen by your choice to prioritize your wants over her rights. Diane's case presented complex challenges because of her severe prescription drug addiction and deteriorating mental health. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that her judgment had been significantly impaired during much of the conspiracy, though she'd clearly understood the basic wrongness of their actions. Her plea agreement resulted in a sentence of supervised release with mandatory rehabilitation treatment, acknowledging her diminished capacity while still holding her accountable for participating in the theft of my inheritance. The civil lawsuit I filed against all 3 of them resulted in damage awards totaling $68 million, including punitive damages designed to deter similar crimes by other families. The calculation included not only my stolen inheritance, but compensation for emotional distress, professional damage, and the costs of fighting their fraud. Federal asset seizure proceedings ensured that most of this judgment would actually be collectible from properties and accounts they'd purchased with stolen money. Harrison Blackwood's prosecution for professional misconduct and fraud revealed that his corruption had affected dozens of families over nearly 20 years. His law license was permanently revoked, and his conviction on federal charges resulted in a 12-year prison sentence. More importantly, his cooperation with investigators led to the discovery of similar inheritance theft schemes operating in multiple states, triggering a nationwide crackdown on lawyers who specialized in helping families steal from elderly relatives. The media coverage of these trials created a platform for discussing the broader issue of family financial abuse and the need for stronger legal protections for inheritance rights. Victoria Chen's follow-up articles documented similar cases across the country, revealing that my experience was unfortunately common among families with substantial wealth. Her reporting helped change how law enforcement and social services approach these crimes, recognizing them as serious felonies rather than private family disputes. Claire's separate trial for conspiracy and money laundering provided additional satisfaction as prosecutors proved her active participation in the scheme despite her claims of innocent involvement. Her conviction and 3-year sentence send a message that romantic partners and friends couldn't escape responsibility for helping families commit inheritance theft. Her desperate attempts to portray herself as another victim of Derek's manipulation were undermined by evidence showing she'd actively encouraged his participation in the fraud. The restitution process became a complex undertaking as federal marshals seized and auctioned properties my family had purchased with stolen money. Their former mansion, luxury cars, vacation homes, and investment portfolios were all liquidated to compensate me for their theft. The public auctions attracted significant media attention, with news coverage showing the complete financial destruction of people who'd once been pillars of the community. Perhaps most satisfying was watching their social status evaporate as former friends and business associates distanced themselves from convicted felons. Country club memberships were revoked, charitable board positions were terminated, and business partnerships dissolved as the community recognized the scope of their criminal behavior. The respectable facade they'd maintained for decades collapsed completely, leaving them isolated and disgraced in addition to facing federal prison sentences. The professional sanctions against lawyers and financial advisors who'd enabled their crimes sent ripple effects throughout the legal and financial services communities. Bar associations implemented stronger oversight procedures for estate administration, and investment firms enhanced their reporting requirements for suspicious transaction patterns. My case became a cautionary tale taught in law schools and business programs as an example of how professional negligence can enable family financial abuse. The federal investigation's final report documented the full scope of their criminal enterprise, revealing connections to organized crime figures and international money laundering operations that none of us had suspected. The sophistication of their fraud qualified it as one of the largest family inheritance theft cases in federal history, with ramifications that extended far beyond our personal relationships. Justice had been served, but the scars from their betrayal would take much longer to heal than their prison sentences would take to complete. 2 years after that devastating night at the charity gala, I stood in Grandmother Ruth's former garden, now part of the memorial park I'd created with portion of my recovered inheritance. The space had been transformed into a place where families could gather to honor loved ones while learning about elder financial abuse prevention. Watching children play near the fountain dedicated to grandmother's memory, I felt a peace that I'd never expected to experience again after the destruction of everything I'd once believed about family and trust. The healing journey had been more challenging than any legal battle I'd fought. Therapy with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a specialist in family trauma and betrayal, helped me understand that my family's crimes weren't a reflection of my worth or judgment. Learning to trust my own perceptions again after months of gaslighting required patience and professional guidance, but gradually I began to rebuild my confidence in my ability to read people and situations accurately. The work was painful but necessary for reclaiming my emotional independence from their manipulation. My relationship with federal prosecutor James Mitchell had developed slowly and carefully, built on a foundation of shared values and mutual respect rather than the false intimacy I'd experienced with Thomas. James understood the complexity of family betrayal because his own career focused on crimes that destroyed trust between relatives. Our connection grew from professional collaboration to personal friendship to something deeper, but always with complete honesty about our individual healing processes and relationship goals. The law practice I'd built specializing in elder abuse prevention and family financial crime had become nationally recognized for its innovative approaches to protecting vulnerable adults from inheritance theft. My experience gave me unique insights into the warning signs and legal strategies that could prevent other families from experiencing the devastation mine had inflicted. Speaking at conferences and training other attorneys about these crimes transformed my personal trauma into professional expertise that helped protect thousands of potential victims. The scholarship fund established in Grandmother Ruth's name had already helped over 50 students pursue careers in legal advocacy and social services. Each recipient committed to spending at least 2 years working in elder protection or family financial crime prevention, creating a network of professionals trained to recognize and combat the types of abuse that had nearly destroyed my life. Grandmother's money was finally being used exactly as she'd intended, honoring her legacy while protecting other families from predatory relatives. Reconciliation attempts from extended family members had been carefully evaluated and mostly declined. Cousins and aunts who'd remained silent during my public destruction now wanted to rebuild relationships, but their failure to support me when I needed help most revealed the shallow nature of their loyalty. I'd learned to distinguish between people who loved me conditionally based on social approval and those who would stand by me regardless of public opinion or family pressure. Derek's letters from federal prison arrived monthly, filled with what seemed like genuine remorse and desperate attempts to repair our relationship. His descriptions of prison life and rehabilitation programs suggested he was finally facing the consequences of his choices, without the enabling that had characterized his entire adult life. While I felt compassion for his suffering, I wasn't prepared to risk my emotional security by trusting someone who'd betrayed me so completely for money. The annual memorial gala honoring Grandmother's legacy had become a major fundraising event for elder abuse prevention organizations nationwide. Held in the same ballroom where my family had attempted their final theft, the event attracted hundreds of advocates, survivors, and professionals working to combat family financial crimes. Standing at the podium where I'd once exposed their fraud, I now delivered keynote speeches about resilience and the importance of protecting vulnerable adults from predatory relatives. Richard's death in federal prison came 18 months into his sentence, apparently from complications related to his gambling addiction and the stress of incarceration. While I felt sadness for the waste of his life and the destruction he'd caused, his passing also brought a sense of closure to the most painful chapter of my betrayal experience. Diane's continued deterioration in supervised care served as a reminder that addiction and mental illness had played roles in their crimes, though they didn't excuse the deliberate nature of their theft. The friendship I'd developed with other inheritance theft survivors had become one of the most meaningful aspects of my recovery process. Meeting people who'd experienced similar family betrayals helped me understand that these crimes were unfortunately common and that healing was possible even after the most devastating violations of trust. Our support group had evolved into a national advocacy organization that lobbied for stronger legal protections and better law enforcement training for family financial crimes. Victoria Chen's book about my case had become required reading in law schools and social work programs across the country. Her detailed documentation of the legal and emotional aspects of family financial abuse provided a blueprint for other survivors while educating professionals about the complexity of these crimes. The book's success had created additional opportunities for speaking and consulting that expanded my ability to help other families avoid or recover from similar betrayals. The question of forgiveness remained complex and evolving. I'd learned to forgive myself for trusting people who'd betrayed me, recognizing that my faith in family relationships was a strength rather than a weakness. Forgiving my family members required separating my anger about their actions from my love for the people they'd once been, accepting that both emotions could coexist without requiring reconciliation or renewed trust. The life I'd built from the ashes of their betrayal was more authentic and purposeful than anything I'd experienced before their crimes forced me to examine my values and relationships. Professional success that came from helping others rather than just earning money felt more meaningful than my previous corporate achievements. Personal relationships based on honesty and mutual support provided security that wealth alone could never guarantee. As I watched the sunset from Grandmother Ruth's memorial garden, I reflected on the wisdom she'd shared about character being revealed during times of crisis. Her faith in my ability to survive and thrive despite family betrayal had been vindicated, though the path had been more difficult than either of us could have anticipated. The inheritance she'd left me was ultimately less important than the strength and values she'd instilled that enabled me to fight for justice and rebuild my life on my own terms. I want to hear from all of you who've made it to the end of this incredible journey with me. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How do you think you would have handled discovering that your own family was stealing from you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because your perspective matters to this community we're building together. If this story of resilience and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories about overcoming family betrayal and fighting for what's right. And don't forget to share this video with anyone who might need to hear that survival and recovery are possible even after the most devastating betrayals. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me, and remember that your worth isn't determined by other people's treatment of you, even when those people are family. Until next time, keep fighting for your truth and never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than justice and respect.